The nurse Lucy Letby has been found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others while they were in her care at a hospital.
Evergreen City was a quiet, unassuming place in the northeastern United States, nestled between dense, shadowy forests and sprawling, sleepy suburbs. The town itself was nothing like the chaotic, busy metropolitan centers where hospitals were often in the news. Evergreen City was the kind of town where everything seemed to hum with normalcy, a place where people left their doors unlocked, children played on the streets until dusk, and neighbors waved as they passed each other on quiet, tree-lined roads. The hospital was its beating heart, a sprawling complex that stood proudly on the outskirts of town, surrounded by meticulously trimmed lawns and modern, glass-fronted buildings. Evergreen City Medical Center was known for its state-of-the-art care and its cutting-edge neonatal unit. For many, it was the best place to be if you needed medical attention, especially for those with vulnerable newborns. The hospital had an excellent reputation, and families from across the state, and even from other parts of the country, came for its renowned neonatal care. Inside the sterile, white walls of the neonatal unit, life seemed to move at a different pace. The air was filled with the soft hum of machines and the quiet beeping of monitors, which kept track of every breath, every heartbeat of the fragile infants in their care. The unit was designed to provide life-saving support for newborns struggling to survive preterm birth, birth defects, or other critical conditions. The nurses here were skilled, dedicated professionals, many of whom had spent years training for this specialized field. The unit had witnessed countless miraculous recoveries and heart-wrenching losses. For the parents of these babies, the neonatal unit was a place of both hope and anxiety, where life hung in the balance every minute of every day. In the middle of this high-stakes environment was Nurse Samantha Gray, a seemingly perfect fit for the job. With her impeccable resume, glowing references, and calm demeanor, she appeared to be a godsend for the fragile infants and their desperate families. She moved through the unit with the grace of someone who had been born to do this work, her presence reassuring in its steadiness. The other nurses often praised her patience and attention to detail, and doctors frequently commented on her ability to handle the most complex, high-risk cases with confidence. She had a way of putting parents at ease, offering them comfort with a smile and a few kind words. To them, Samantha was more than just a nurse, she was a lifeline. Yet beneath her perfect facade, something sinister began to take root. At first, it was barely noticeable, a strange, almost imperceptible tension in the air. The neonatal unit, with its walls lined with incubators and its nurses constantly monitoring the babies, had always been a place of quiet concern. But over time, a disturbing pattern started to emerge. Babies who had seemed to be improving suddenly took a turn for the worse, their conditions worsening inexplicably. A few of the babies who had been progressing well began to exhibit strange symptoms that didn't fit their diagnoses. Some seemed to have trouble breathing for no apparent reason, while others were found with unexplained bruises or swelling. In the early stages, the doctors assumed it was simply a coincidence, a series of unfortunate setbacks in an already unpredictable environment. But as time went on, those coincidences began to pile up. It was in the summer of 2017 that the first whispers of suspicion began to circulate among the staff. Nurse Gray, despite her professionalism, had developed a reputation for being oddly present at the times when things went wrong. She was always there when a baby's condition suddenly took a turn for the worse, always involved when a child seemed to be slipping away, despite the best efforts of the doctors and other nurses. It wasn't that anyone could point to anything concrete, there were no glaring mistakes or obvious signs that Samantha was doing anything wrong. But there was an unsettling feeling in the air. A murmur, barely audible but growing louder with every passing day. The strange thing was that, even in the midst of all this, Samantha never seemed rattled. She didn't appear stressed or anxious, even when things took a dark turn. She remained calm, almost unnervingly so, always offering reassurances to parents and colleagues alike. Her ability to mask any sign of distress was, in itself, unsettling. No one could quite explain why, but something felt off. Then came the first major incident. A baby named Emma, born prematurely at 28 weeks, had been in the unit for several weeks. She had been fighting hard, and after a few setbacks, she seemed to be stabilizing. Her parents, exhausted but hopeful, were beginning to make plans to bring her home. But one morning, Emma's condition rapidly deteriorated, seemingly without explanation. Her breathing became labored, her skin turned pale, and within hours she was gone. The cause of death was unclear. The doctors suspected infection, but no specific pathogen could be identified. They did a thorough examination, but nothing stood out as abnormal. Emma's death was tragic, but at first there were no immediate signs of foul play. Yet as the days passed, something didn't sit right with the medical staff. The pattern of unexplained deaths seemed to be growing. Babies that had been stable for weeks suddenly deteriorated, often during Samantha's shifts. The numbers didn't make sense of all the neonatal units in the state. Evergreen cities had started to experience an unusually high rate of unexpected deaths. And it was always when Samantha was around. By the winter of 2017, the hospital was on edge. Dr. Emily Jacobs, a pediatrician with years of experience in the neonatal unit, began to notice the disturbing trend. She had worked with Samantha before and never thought much of her demeanor. But now, in the midst of these unexplained deaths, something began to gnaw at her. Emily, always the professional, kept her suspicions to herself at first. But as the deaths continued to mount, it became harder to ignore the evidence. Samantha, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the growing unease among her colleagues. She continued to perform her duties with her usual efficiency, going about her work as though nothing was wrong. The parents, too, continued to trust her, grateful for her caring, supportive presence during their children's most vulnerable days. But behind the hospital's polished doors, a quiet dread began to settle over the neonatal unit. The hospital had always prided itself on being a place of hope, where even the most fragile of babies could be given a chance at life. But now, a dark shadow was slowly creeping through its halls, unnoticed by all but a few who dared to question the inexplicable deaths. As the bodies of the infants piled up, those who had once trusted in the hospital began to wonder if they had been walking into a trap, if the very place that had promised to save their children might have been the one to take them. The questions grew louder, but still no one had any proof. There were no smoking guns, no fingerprints to point to, just a growing sense of dread. The hospital administrators, already under pressure to maintain the institution's reputation, refused to act on rumors. They would have to face the consequences eventually, but for now they turned a blind eye to the mounting evidence. By the time the public inquiry was finally launched, it was too late to save the babies whose lives had already been stolen. The hospital's legacy had been marred, its walls forever stained with the silent screams of those who had perished under its watch. And Nurse Samantha Gray, once a trusted and cherished member of the team, had managed to slip through the cracks, hiding in plain sight, until the truth finally began to claw its way to the surface. Samantha Gray had always been a person of remarkable composure. From a young age, she exuded a quiet kind of confidence, the kind that commanded respect without the need for words. People often remarked on her stillness, a calmness that was both soothing and unnerving. It was as if she carried a secret, one that neither she nor anyone else fully understood. Raised in a quiet, suburban town not far from Evergreen City, Samantha had always been the perfect student, the kind who effortlessly excelled in her studies and made every activity seem natural. She had a magnetic charm about her, the kind that drew people in without them even realizing it. Her peers admired her for her intelligence and grace, and teachers often described her as one of the brightest students they had ever encountered. But despite all the attention, there was always something slightly aloof about her. Samantha was not one to engage in the typical social interactions that most young people indulged in. She didn't go to parties, didn't stay up late gossiping or joking with friends. Instead, she spent her time reading, studying, and focusing on her goals. It was as if she had a singular vision that no one else could see. That vision, she later realized, was to work in healthcare, where she could help others in a way that felt meaningful, a way that would provide her with the recognition and respect she so deeply craved. The idea of becoming a nurse, especially a neonatal nurse, was born from a deep-seated need to save lives, to be someone who could make a tangible difference. She viewed the vulnerable infants under her care not as patients, but as delicate beings whose lives she could control, whose survival or demise rested within her hands. When Samantha entered nursing school, her natural ability to connect with others made her a favorite among her instructors. She was intuitive, perceptive, able to read the room, to sense the exact needs of her patients even before they were spoken aloud. Her fellow students were often in awe of her calm efficiency, her ability to perform under pressure. Her grades were perfect, and she moved through her clinical rotations with the kind of ease that others could only dream of. She volunteered for the most challenging cases, eager to prove herself as the top of her class, the one who could handle the toughest situations. But beneath the surface, a darker side of Samantha began to emerge. She found herself drawn to the fragility of life, to the thin line between life and death that was constantly before her in the neonatal unit. The idea of controlling that line, of having the power to save or to end life, fascinated her in ways she couldn't fully explain. There was a cold thrill in knowing that her actions could shift the balance, that she had the power to intervene in such a delicate, irreversible way. The idea of making a child live or die, of being the one to decide their fate, began to consume her thoughts. When Samantha graduated and secured a position at Evergreen City Medical Center's prestigious neonatal unit, she felt as if she had finally arrived. She was now part of something greater, something that gave her the authority and the respect she had always craved. The first time she walked into the neonatal ward, she felt an undeniable sense of belonging. The sterile white walls, the hum of the machines, the quiet urgency of the doctors and nurses around her, it all felt like a well-choreographed dance, and Samantha was its central figure. She reveled in the environment's high stakes, the constant sense of life hanging in the balance. It was exactly what she had been searching for. Her colleagues quickly noticed her ability to fit in seamlessly with the team. Samantha exuded a professionalism that impressed even the most seasoned doctors. She was efficient, precise, and always ready to help when needed. Her calm demeanor made her a favorite among families whose infants were in critical condition. She was approachable, empathetic, and always knew exactly what to say to comfort them. She offered them the hope they needed in their darkest moments, even though there was a part of her that felt detached from their pain. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that, in the quiet recesses of her mind, she wasn't sure she wanted to save them all. Samantha found herself fascinated by the infants who were most at risk, those who seemed to hang on the edge of life, teetering between survival and death. The more fragile the baby, the more drawn she was to them. She found herself obsessing over their conditions, watching their monitors with an intensity that bordered on fixation. She could spend hours staring at a premature baby, marveling at how the smallest changes in their breathing or heart rate could signal a shift toward either life or death. She didn't see them as human beings in the conventional sense. To her, they were puzzles to be solved, experiments to be observed, opportunities to manipulate and control. The idea of playing God began to consume her. She would find herself wondering, in the quiet moments when she was alone with a baby, what it would be like to have the power to control whether they lived or died. She told herself that she wanted to save them, but deep down she knew that there was a part of her that wanted to test the limits of her control. It was an obsession, one she couldn't shake, and it only grew stronger as time went on. As she settled into her role at the hospital, Samantha became increasingly involved in cases where the babies seemed the most critical. She wasn't the type to shy away from difficult situations. She sought them out, eager for the challenge, for the rush of adrenaline that came with a life and death crisis. But it was in these moments that something darker began to emerge. Samantha discovered that the infants who seemed most fragile, those who were struggling to breathe or whose hearts were failing, could be manipulated in ways she had never anticipated. She started with small actions, adjusting the oxygen levels slightly, changing the medications without notifying the attending physician, injecting the babies with minute amounts of insulin, just enough to induce a small, unexplained dip in their blood sugar. At first, it was easy to justify. These babies were already critically ill, and a little adjustment here or there wouldn't hurt. But the more she experimented, the more she saw the power she wielded. She found herself testing the limits of her own control, finding ways to make them live and sometimes to make them die. The deaths began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as babies who had been stable suddenly deteriorated. Samantha, always present during these critical moments, offered comfort to the parents, even as she watched the life drain from their infants. She made sure to be there when it happened, offering herself as a source of calm in the chaos. No one suspected her. Why would they? She was a model nurse, a professional, a saint in the eyes of those around her. She wore her role like armor, blending in perfectly with the other staff, never allowing a crack to show. Yet, as the months passed, Samantha's obsession grew. The thrill of controlling life and death was no longer enough. She wanted more. She wanted to see if she could outsmart the doctors, if she could make it so that the deaths seemed like natural occurrences, so that no one would ever suspect her. The babies she targeted, those who were teetering on the edge of survival, became mere pawns in her game. Their parents, their families, their hopes, they were all just part of the carefully constructed illusion she created. And no one, not even her closest colleagues, saw the darkness that lingered beneath her calm exterior. Samantha Gray was, in every sense, a master of her craft. She could control the smallest of details, could manipulate the circumstances surrounding her without ever being noticed. She had the ability to create life and death in the most delicate of ways, all while maintaining the perfect facade of innocence. She was a woman who had found her true calling not in saving lives, but in controlling them. And in doing so, she had become something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The first death happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. Little Charlie, a fragile preemie born at just 24 weeks, had been in the neonatal unit for nearly a month. His parents, young and hopeful, had spent every moment at his bedside, watching with tearful eyes as their son fought for his life. They had known it would be a struggle, the doctors had made that clear, but they had hoped for a miracle, as so many parents did. And for a while it seemed like that miracle might come. Charlie's condition stabilized, his breathing improved. He was beginning to gain weight. The soft hum of the incubator, once a source of anxiety, had become a reassuring presence in the room. But then, during the night shift, something shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. The monitor showed a small drop in Charlie's oxygen levels, but nothing out of the ordinary. Samantha Gray was the one who noticed. She had been watching Charlie for days, almost obsessively, fascinated by the tiny movements of his chest as he fought to stay alive. The delicate rise and fall of his ribs, the soft whir of the ventilator, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, everything about Charlie seemed fragile and beautiful to her. But it was also controllable. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but somewhere in the quiet moments of the night, Samantha saw an opportunity. It was easy enough to adjust the oxygen levels slightly, just enough to cause a minor dip in his breathing. It wasn't enough to be immediately alarming, just enough to see if he would recover on his own. There was something undeniably thrilling about it, watching as his small body struggled to find the breath it needed, just a little nudge away from the edge. The thrill deepened when she saw the monitor's numbers drop further, so subtly that no one else would notice. Charlie's body didn't recover. The next morning, when the doctors arrived, they found his condition had worsened overnight. His heart rate was erratic, his blood oxygen levels dangerously low. The doctors worked frantically to stabilize him, but it was too late. Little Charlie's tiny body had given up the fight. The death was classified as a complication from his premature birth, a tragic but not unexpected outcome. No one suspected anything unusual. No one suspected Samantha. As the days passed, the hospital staff began to see a pattern. Babies who seemed to be improving suddenly took a turn for the worse. Their conditions would deteriorate quickly, without warning. The doctors would try to find the cause, often blaming infection or the complications of prematurity, but the answers were never clear. Babies who had been stable for days, or even weeks, were suddenly dead. And each time, Samantha was there, quietly moving through the background, always present when the decline began, but never overtly involved. The second death came a few weeks later, this time a little girl named Olivia. Born at 29 weeks, Olivia had struggled early on, but after a few weeks in the NICU, she had shown signs of improvement. Her parents, who had been beside themselves with worry, began to breathe a little easier. They were still cautious, still afraid to get their hopes up too high. But for the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to think about what life might be like once their daughter was strong enough to go home. They spent long hours at her incubator, whispering words of comfort and love, holding her tiny hand through the glass, and watching her sleep. But one night, as the shift changed, Samantha was assigned to Olivia. As usual, she moved through the unit with calm precision, checking vitals, adjusting incubators, making sure everything was running smoothly. Olivia, though fragile, was stable. Samantha noticed the baby's heart rate was steady, her breathing smooth. But then, in that moment, an idea began to form in the back of Samantha's mind. What would happen, she wondered, if she just gave Olivia a little more milk? The baby had been feeding well, but her parents were often so cautious, too fearful of overfeeding. Samantha, in her calm, quiet way, could see an opportunity. It was almost too easy. She increased the flow of milk into the feeding tube, watching as Olivia's stomach began to swell with the excess. It wasn't a huge amount, just enough to push her little body beyond its limits. The result was as devastating as it was thrilling. Olivia's tiny body couldn't process the sudden influx of milk, and she began to choke. At first, it was subtle, a small sound from her throat. But soon, the alarm started to go off, and the nurses scrambled to intervene. Olivia's heart rate shot up, and her breathing became erratic. Samantha stood by, calmly observing, almost detached from the frenzy that was unfolding. By the time the doctors arrived, Olivia had gone into cardiac arrest. They worked desperately, but in the end, it was another life lost. The official cause of death was listed as aspiration pneumonia, caused by the baby choking on the milk, a common risk for preemies. The attending physicians didn't think twice. After all, Olivia had been on the edge for weeks. It wasn't unusual for a baby that premature to suffer such complications. Samantha had done nothing out of the ordinary, nothing anyone could trace back to her. Another tragedy, another loss that didn't seem to have an explanation. But it wasn't long before the deaths began to pile up, and the similarities became impossible to ignore. Babies who had been improving, babies who had been so close to leaving the unit, suddenly took sharp turns for the worse. The pattern emerged in eerie detail, and it was always when Samantha was working her shift. No one dared to say anything outright. No one could, not without concrete proof. But the whispers began. Her calm, serene demeanor became unsettling to some. Samantha, for her part, remained unshaken. She never wavered. She continued her work with precision, her movements methodical and controlled, as if nothing had changed. To her, the deaths were part of a much larger, more fascinating puzzle. Each one was an experiment, a test of her power. She wasn't just saving lives, she was controlling them. And with every death, she felt more invincible, more in control. The babies, the families, the doctors, they were all part of her grand design. It was during a particularly tense week in early spring that the third death occurred. This time it was baby Lucas, a 23-week-old preemie who had been struggling for survival since birth. He had been through so much already: countless tests, constant monitoring, and multiple surgeries to correct his underdeveloped organs. Yet, against all odds, Lucas had begun to show signs of life. His heart rate had stabilized, his breathing had become more rhythmic, and his weight was slowly increasing. For the first time, it seemed like there was hope. But hope was something that Samantha had long ago abandoned. Hope was a fragile illusion, something that distracted people from the truth. The truth was that she alone had the power to decide who lived and who died. Lucas, like the others, was just another part of her experiment. This time, Samantha decided to take a different approach. Instead of adjusting the oxygen or manipulating the feeding schedule, she chose something more direct. She injected a small, calculated amount of insulin into Lucas' bloodstream, just enough to cause his blood sugar levels to drop dangerously low. The effect was almost immediate. His little body began to show signs of distress. His skin turned pale, his hands and feet grew cold. The nurses noticed, but by the time they acted, it was too late. The official cause of death was determined to be insulin shock, a rare but possible complication in severely premature infants. Again, the doctors found no fault with Samantha's actions. She had done nothing wrong, and no one could connect the dots between her presence and the deaths that seemed to plague the unit. But in the cold, sterile rooms of the neonatal unit, something far darker was taking shape. Each death, each new tragedy, was another step in a twisted dance that Samantha had orchestrated with chilling precision. The babies died, one by one, and each time, she became more and more untouchable, her hold over life and death becoming more absolute. She was the invisible hand behind every loss, every broken heart, and no one could see the truth. And Samantha, for the first time, allowed herself to feel the full extent of her power. The hospital was an institution of great prestige, one of the finest in Evergreen City, known for its state-of-the-art equipment, its highly trained medical staff, and its commitment to cutting-edge care. The neonatal unit, where the most fragile infants were cared for, was no exception. It was a space of constant vigilance, where every breath, every heartbeat, was monitored with the utmost precision. Nurses and doctors moved in sync, like a finely tuned machine, responding to the needs of the babies with unwavering dedication. It was a place of life, where miracles were supposed to happen, a sanctuary for newborns teetering on the edge of survival. But like all institutions, the hospital had its flaws. Beneath the surface of excellence lay a web of bureaucratic complacency, of red tape that stifled communication and fostered an atmosphere where concerns could be easily ignored. The neonatal unit, despite its reputation, had become a place where things often slipped through the cracks. Overworked staff, long hours, and an overwhelming sense of urgency sometimes led to mistakes. It was easy to dismiss small anomalies as nothing more than the natural unpredictability of preterm births. After all, these were babies born before their time, their bodies not fully developed, their survival rates uncertain. In such an environment, it became difficult to tell where the line between misfortune and mismanagement lay. Samantha Gray, with her calm, composed demeanor, became a master at exploiting these cracks. She knew exactly how to navigate the labyrinth of hospital protocols, how to blend into the background, how to move with such precision that no one would notice the subtle alterations she made. To the hospital staff, she was the epitome of professionalism, a model nurse who seemed to effortlessly handle the stress and challenges of the neonatal unit. She was the nurse you could always count on, the one who never faltered, never showed signs of weakness, even during the most difficult shifts. It wasn't that the hospital was blind to the possibility of errors. Every hospital had its internal reviews, its quality control checks, its regular audits. But those were designed to catch mistakes, not deliberate actions. And in the case of Samantha Gray, The deaths that occurred in the neonatal unit were anything but ordinary. They were carefully orchestrated, methodical, and, at first glance, inconspicuous. Babies dying, especially in a neonatal unit, was not an unusual occurrence. Preterm births were fraught with complications, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, some babies simply didn't make it. The deaths were tragic, of course, but they were not immediately suspicious. After all, the babies who passed away had been at the edge of life from the moment they were born. They had been underweight, underdeveloped, and fragile. Their deaths seemed almost inevitable, like an unfortunate side effect of their early arrival. It wasn't until the third death, little Lucas, that the first cracks in the system began to show. Lucas had been another preemie, fragile and weak, but he had also shown remarkable improvement for a time. The doctors had been optimistic, his vitals steady, his weight slowly creeping up to a more acceptable range. But then, with no apparent warning, his condition deteriorated. Samantha had been the one on duty when it happened, but no one paid attention to the subtle signs. There had been no reason to suspect foul play. The monitors had shown his blood sugar levels dropping, but there was no indication of an error in his care. The shift nurses had noted that Lucas seemed slightly more lethargic than usual, but again, that wasn't uncommon in preemies. They chalked it up to fatigue, to the long hours and the strain on his tiny body. The doctors were notified, of course, but by the time they arrived, Lucas had already slipped into a coma, his little body unresponsive. His heart rate had dropped to dangerously low levels. He was gone within hours. The cause of death was listed as insulin shock, but there was no one to connect the dots, no one to ask the question that was beginning to take root in the minds of a few of the more seasoned nurses: why had this happened? It was an odd, rare event, but not entirely impossible. Newborns, especially preemies, could suffer from hypoglycemia and insulin overdoses, though rare, were occasionally reported in neonatal care. The hospital administrators dismissed it as a tragic anomaly, one that simply couldn't be explained. They were busy, after all, with dozens of other cases demanding attention. They were overwhelmed with the daily operations of the hospital, the constant influx of new patients, the never-ending stream of births, surgeries, and treatments. A small death here and there, especially in the neonatal unit, was just part of the job. And with no direct evidence to suggest foul play, the deaths were classified as complications of prematurity. But as the weeks passed, the deaths continued, and the pattern started to emerge more clearly. Babies who had been making progress, who had been showing signs of recovery, suddenly deteriorated without warning. The doctors and nurses, though seasoned and competent, were caught in a cycle of crisis management. Every day brought new challenges, new patients, and new lives on the line. The pressure was immense. There was simply no time to stop and consider the possibility that something, or someone, was intentionally causing these deaths. The hospital had systems in place to report concerns, of course. There were incident reports that nurses and doctors were supposed to fill out when they observed something suspicious. But in an environment where every minute counted, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, such reports often got buried under the weight of more urgent tasks. The hospital's focus was always on the immediate crisis, on saving lives, not investigating deaths. And so, when a nurse like Samantha, someone with a reputation for competence, made small, seemingly innocuous adjustments, no one noticed. No one raised an eyebrow when she altered a feeding schedule or adjusted oxygen levels. The few who did begin to notice the deaths couldn't quite put their finger on the problem. There were murmurs among the staff, senior doctors who had been in the field long enough to know that something wasn't right. They saw the same names cropping up in the death reports. They saw the familiar pattern: babies who had been improving suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse, always under Samantha's watch. But even then, the whispers were only just that, whispers. No one was willing to make an accusation without solid proof. And the hospital administration, ever focused on maintaining its reputation, didn't want to entertain the idea that something so sinister could be happening under their nose. The truth, of course, was that no one was looking closely enough. The deaths were happening in the shadows, where the hospital's policies and procedures failed to reach. Samantha was far too careful, far too methodical. She knew exactly how to avoid suspicion, how to work within the system's blind spots. She was patient, waiting for the right moments to strike, knowing that the hospital would never question her. The deaths were tragic, yes, but they were also easily dismissed as the inevitable losses of preterm births. As the bodies continued to pile up, the hospital remained unaware of the darker force lurking within its walls. The staff continued to work in the same rhythm, the same routines. The administration carried on with their daily tasks, focusing on the demands of the present, never stopping to consider the growing shadows that were slowly overtaking the hospital. Samantha Gray remained a trusted figure, a professional, a model nurse. No one knew that behind her calm smile and her impeccable work ethic lay a mind capable of something far more sinister. And so the hospital, its leaders, its staff remained blind to the evil that was taking root, right under their noses, in the very place where life was supposed to be protected. But ignorance, in the face of growing death, would only be a temporary shield. Eventually, the truth would come crashing down. And when it did, it would reveal the cracks in the hospital's seemingly impenetrable armor, cracks that had allowed a monster to walk freely among them. It all began with a simple observation, a fleeting, almost trivial moment. One of the neonatal unit's senior nurses, Michelle Parker, had been working the night shift when she noticed something odd. It was subtle, like the rustle of a thread about to break, barely perceptible but nagging enough to prick at her attention. She had been covering for a colleague who was out sick, and as she made her rounds, something about the night felt off. The babies in the unit were unusually still. Not that it was alarming, not in itself. But after several months of working in the department, Michelle had learned to trust her instincts. The rhythm of the unit, the pulse of activity, it was always so constant, so predictable. But tonight there was a stillness that unsettled her. She found herself looking at the monitors more often than usual, observing how the numbers flickered across the screens in a pattern she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the first time she had noticed something strange in the ward. A few weeks earlier, she had begun to notice an unusually high number of deaths among babies who seemed to be improving, babies who had stabilized for days or even weeks, only to suddenly take a rapid decline. Michelle had been a nurse for over a decade, and though death was a frequent visitor in the neonatal unit, the frequency of these deaths struck her as odd. What troubled her more was the fact that each time, Samantha Gray had been present during the shifts leading up to the baby's declines. At first she had dismissed it. After all, nurses rotated through shifts constantly. It was bound to happen that one particular nurse would be around for a series of deaths. But tonight, as she moved from one bed to the next, checking vitals and adjusting incubators, Michelle felt a deeper, more unsettling sensation growing inside her. It was hard to articulate, but something about the way the deaths had occurred in such quick succession, it wasn't just coincidence. There had to be something more to it. The next day, she decided to take her concerns to Dr. Susan Harrison, one of the senior neonatologists. Dr. Harrison had been working in neonatal care for nearly 20 years and had seen her fair share of tragedies. She was pragmatic, calm under pressure, and as experienced as anyone in the unit. But when Michelle brought up the unusual number of sudden deaths, the doctor brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "You know how it is in this unit, Michelle. These babies are fighting for their lives every second. Prematurity, underdevelopment, infection, there are so many variables. We can't start pointing fingers every time we lose one." But Michelle wasn't convinced. The doubt in her mind had started to grow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way the deaths seemed to cluster together, the consistency of them, was too much to ignore. It wasn't just that babies died, it was how they died. And Samantha had been involved with each one. Determined, Michelle quietly began to review the logs of the past few weeks. She spent hours combing through the medical records of every infant who had passed away during the night shifts. She didn't find much at first. After all, death in the neonatal unit was always chalked up to the same list of causes: prematurity, infection, heart failure, respiratory distress. But as she went through the records, she began to see the names of the babies repeating. The same few nurses listed in the care logs, the same shifts. And there it was. Samantha's name appeared in the records for every death. The hairs on the back of Michelle's neck stood up. It was too much to be a coincidence. With a cold pit forming in her stomach, Michelle decided to take a different approach. She started tracking Samantha's activities more closely. She reviewed the baby monitoring logs during Samantha's shifts, watching for any anomalies in the baby's vitals. She began to note the precise times when the most significant drops in oxygen levels, blood pressure, and heart rate occurred. It was a meticulous task, one that required long hours of scrutiny, but after several nights of watching and reviewing, she found something disturbing. The drops in the infant's vital signs were not random. They occurred with eerie precision, always at the same moments, during the same hours of Samantha's shifts. The most chilling finding came when Michelle reviewed the oxygen administration logs. She noticed a disturbing trend on several occasions. The oxygen levels of the infants had been altered just before their deterioration. It wasn't a huge shift, just enough to lower the oxygen saturation slightly, not enough to set off the alarms, but enough to put stress on their fragile bodies. The amounts of insulin administered to a few of the babies were also strangely inconsistent, though not overtly excessive. It was subtle, too subtle to be flagged by the regular checks, but when combined with the other irregularities, it was impossible to ignore. Someone was tampering with the baby's care. Michelle's heart raced as she pieced everything together. The unsettling pattern. The small changes, the moments when the baby's conditions took a turn for the worse. It was like watching a script play out with Samantha in the lead role, orchestrating the deaths one by one in plain sight. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Michelle knew she had no direct proof. There were no physical signs of foul play, no smoking gun. She would have to tread carefully if she was wrong. It could ruin her career, and worse, it could destroy lives. But if she was right, with a heavy heart, Michelle made the decision to approach Dr. Harrison again. This time, however, she had more than just her gut instinct. She had gathered data, numbers, times, records, and discrepancies. She laid it all out for the doctor, presenting the evidence in a quiet, measured tone. Dr. Harrison listened intently, her brow furrowing as Michelle spoke. For a long moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the doctor leaned back in her chair. "You're not wrong to be concerned," Dr. Harrison said, her voice low. "But you're also not the only one who's noticed the pattern. There are others who've had similar thoughts, though no one has come forward yet. I think we need to look into this more seriously. But we have to be careful, Michelle. Accusations like these." "They're not just accusations," Michelle interjected, her voice shaking with frustration. "The numbers don't lie. The babies are dying on our watch, and I'm the one who has to clean up the mess. We need to stop this before more children suffer." The doctor nodded gravely. "I know, we'll look into it. We need to get a full audit of the care logs, the medication records, everything. We'll also need to get the hospital's legal team involved. But be warned, if this is true, it could shake the very foundations of this hospital. We'll have to move carefully." And so the investigation began. It started with a series of audits, with Michelle and Dr. Harrison working together in secret to review the care logs and medication records from the past 6 months. They brought in external experts, hospital administrators, forensic specialists, and medical examiners to examine the files. But as they dug deeper, the horrifying truth became undeniable. The alterations to the baby's treatment were not just coincidental. The insulin doses, the oxygen changes, the feeding schedules, they were all part of a deliberate pattern of sabotage. And Samantha was at the center of it all. Soon, whispers of the investigation spread throughout the hospital. A quiet, nervous tension settled over the staff as rumors began to swirl. Some defended Samantha, insisting that there had to be some mistake. Others, like Michelle, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The hospital's legal team was called in, and a formal investigation was launched. In the weeks that followed, Samantha's every move was scrutinized. Security cameras were reviewed, her shift logs double-checked, and even the medical records were combed through with meticulous care. It became clear that the deaths were not random. They were calculated, orchestrated, and planned. And as the evidence piled up, the discovery that would eventually rock the hospital to its core seemed almost too terrible to believe. Samantha Gray, once seen as the model nurse, the epitome of care and professionalism, had been the one orchestrating the deaths of the infants under her care. She had been playing a macabre game, manipulating the delicate lives of the babies, all while remaining beyond suspicion. She had managed to slip under the radar, manipulating systems and protocols, her crimes concealed by the very systems meant to protect the babies. The investigation was only the beginning. What followed would unravel the dark secrets of the hospital, the cover-ups, the failures of oversight, and the terrifying truth about the monster lurking within. But at that moment, as the hospital began to grapple with the implications, no one knew just how deep the rot ran. All they knew was that the nightmare had only just begun. The discovery of Samantha Gray's crimes was like a storm breaking over Evergreen City, but the full force of the devastation would not be felt until the truth spilled into the public eye. The hospital, once a beacon of hope and medical advancement, had become the center of a scandal so monstrous that it rippled through the community, spreading fear, outrage, and disbelief. The initial whispers in the corridors of the hospital, murmurs of something sinister lurking beneath the surface, exploded into a public outcry when the news broke. What had been a quiet, internal investigation became a media frenzy, one that no one, least of all the administrators of the hospital, had been prepared for. The first reports were sensational. News outlets across the city and beyond ran stories that carried the word serial killer in the headlines. Every angle of Samantha Gray's life was dissected, from her spotless resume to the strange gaps in her personal history. Journalists camped outside the hospital, pressuring doctors, nurses, and even the janitorial staff for any scrap of information they could get. The air of normalcy that had surrounded the hospital quickly vanished, replaced by a cloud of suspicion and horror. Families of the victims, some of them had only just buried their babies, began to speak out, demanding answers. Some had already suspected that their infants' deaths had been preventable. Others were blindsided, devastated by the revelation that the woman they had trusted to care for their newborns was responsible for their deaths. Parents, already grieving the loss of their children, found their pain compounded by the horrific truth. In the wake of the news, a wave of anger began to wash over the city. Protests erupted outside the hospital's gates. The front lawn, usually a quiet, well-kept space, was now filled with signs reading "Justice for our babies, never again," and "Expose the monster." News anchors stood outside the hospital in front of makeshift memorials, holding back tears as they spoke about the impact of the case on the community. The general public had become a cacophony of emotions: disbelief, rage, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The image of a trusted medical professional, a nurse who had dedicated her life to healing, had been shattered in an instant. The backlash against the hospital's leadership was swift and unforgiving. The institution, which had prided itself on its high standards of care, found itself under intense scrutiny. The hospital's administrators were accused of failing to act on multiple red flags, of ignoring concerns raised by staff, and of allowing the deaths to continue despite growing suspicions. The investigation that had started as a quiet, careful procedure now turned into a full-scale inquiry, with questions being raised about every level of management. The question on everyone's lips was simple: how could this happen? How could a nurse, someone who had been entrusted with the most vulnerable lives, carry out such horrors under the very noses of the staff? The public outcry didn't stop at protests. There were calls for criminal investigations into the hospital's leadership. Families who had lost babies during Samantha's time at the hospital sought legal counsel, filing wrongful death lawsuits, demanding compensation for the lives lost, and for the negligence that had allowed this to continue. Lawyers representing the victims worked tirelessly, poring over medical records, autopsy reports, and staffing logs to uncover every piece of evidence they could to build their cases. They held press conferences, speaking to the media about the horrors of what had happened, giving voice to the families who had been silenced by grief. The hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting, and the CEO was forced to address the situation publicly for the first time. His statement was meant to reassure the public, but it only deepened the feeling of mistrust. He expressed shock and disbelief at the revelations, but his words were hollow, seemingly rehearsed. He promised that a full investigation would take place, that accountability would be pursued at every level. But the more the public learned about the situation, the more they realized that this had been an institution built on complacency and negligence, a system that had failed not just the babies who died, but the entire community that had placed its trust in them. Amidst the public outrage, the case against Samantha Gray moved forward in the courts. But as the trial gained momentum, new details began to emerge, and the horrifying scope of her crimes became clearer. During the investigation, it was revealed that the nurse had a well-planned system of selecting her victims. She hadn't just randomly targeted infants, she had been methodical. The babies she harmed were often those with a greater chance of survival, those who seemed strong enough to make it. Samantha had chosen them for the very reason that their deaths would be more shocking, more inexplicable. Her colleagues, those who had worked alongside her for years, were left in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the kind, seemingly professional woman they knew with the monster that the investigation had uncovered. Some of them were racked with guilt, wondering if they had missed the signs, wondering how they had failed to recognize the dark undercurrents of Samantha's behavior. Others were more defensive, arguing that the deaths could have been caused by a variety of factors, that the hospital's conditions were not perfect, that mistakes happened all the time in such a high-stakes environment. But as the evidence mounted, videotaped confessions, forensic evidence linking Samantha to the deaths, testimonies from her colleagues who had quietly noticed odd behaviors in her work, the truth could no longer be denied. The media portrayed her as cold and calculating, a woman with no remorse, whose only goal was to inflict suffering. Her trial became a media circus, with journalists and the public glued to every new revelation, every new piece of evidence. For the families of the victims, the trial offered a chance for justice, but it was bittersweet. The damage had already been done, their children were gone, and no legal proceeding could ever undo the pain of that loss. The anger that had been simmering in the public sphere now turned to demands for reform. How could such a tragedy be allowed to happen? How many other hospitals had overlooked similar dangers? How many more families had been affected by medical negligence, by the complacency of those in charge? People began to ask broader questions about the medical system, about accountability, about trust. In the aftermath, hospital reforms were pushed forward. The public demanded greater oversight, more transparency, and tighter regulations on medical staffing. There were protests at hospitals across the country, calling for better safeguards to protect patients, especially the most vulnerable. New systems for reporting medical errors were implemented, with stricter penalties for those who failed to act on potential threats to patients. But the reforms, though important, felt like a hollow victory. The hospital never fully recovered from the scandal. Its reputation, once pristine, was forever tarnished. Though it continued to operate, its trust with the community was irrevocably broken. The executives responsible for the cover-up faced their own investigations, and in some cases, criminal charges. Some lost their jobs, their careers shattered in the wake of the scandal. The ripple effects of the tragedy reached far beyond the hospital walls, touching every family who had ever trusted the institution with their care. Samantha Gray, meanwhile, was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But that, too, felt inadequate. It did not bring back the babies, nor could it erase the images of parents holding funeral services for their newborns. The city, the hospital, and the families who had been directly affected by the tragedy were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The scar of what had happened would never heal completely. And as the months passed, the memory of the scandal faded from the front pages of the news, but it lingered in the collective consciousness. People remembered. The city remembered. And the hospital, forever tainted by its darkest chapter, could never quite recover from the public outcry that had exposed the truth. For those who had been touched by the tragedy, the trauma was something they would carry for the rest of their lives, a bitter reminder of how trust had been so violently shattered, and how the darkest horrors could be hidden behind the mask of professionalism.